Welcome to the 18th century. And an explosion of creativity in a country obsessed with the chic of the new and rich enough from trade and conquest to pay for it.
Well, one reason we might care about the 18th century is a lot of it is still around us.
I don't know if I love the 18th century, but I'm fascinated by it. Everything is happening at that time. There's a change of value systems. There's literally a new world emerging.
There's a revolutionary age, maybe the most revolutionary century there's ever been. There's the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution. It's literally the century in which the modern world is born.
Told through vivid painting, vicious satire, and radical writing, this is a story of how an age of exploitation stirs a growing social conscience.
It is the century in which the sort of Britain that we understand and that we would be proud of and ashamed of comes into being.
This is just one chapter in an epic journey across 1,500 years, through 8 dramatic turning points of history, as contemporary artists and thinkers encounter artworks that defined their age.
Man, can he paint?
Exploring extraordinary creations from around the UK.
You know, you'd think that was God.
The work of past visionaries, mavericks, and rule breakers who responded to their times and shaped the future.
Yeah, got it. This is it.
Oh, look at that. I want to cry.
Tracing a story of creativity, revealing an alternative history of these islands, told through art. Modern Britain is born in 1707, with the Act of Union between England and Scotland. This is an expanding superpower, armed with a new, rational, scientific way of thinking. But a large part of its success is built on the profits of empire and slavery.
It works because it makes people money, and money is the driver for all this growth and experimentation and industrialization. It's very difficult to say that, but as a system, slavery was very, very efficient in driving this economic growth.
And it helps bankroll what would become a British design classic, the Grand Country House.
I was lucky that I had access to these amazing places. I lived in a very small council house in London, and we would get taken on day trips to the national heritage sites with grounds like this and facades like this. And it was amazing. You know, the contrast in scale and ambition and that sense of expectation, entitlement, or whatever you want to call it, this idea of, you know, you have arrived.
The British Empire has taken over from the Roman Empire and assimilated many of their architectural tropes. There's a sense that we're trying to say, look, we are supported by the same mathematically regular columns.
I think it conveys precisely the conflict in thinking about the 18th century that I'm most interested in. We need to see the bullshit behind the facade.
Thomas J. Price is a sculptor from London.
Wow.
In 2015, he exhibited work here at Harewood. His anonymised black faces took their place amongst the illustrious white ones. In a house with 181 rooms.
I mean, this to me looks like a real statement. It's huge. I mean, it looks royal, doesn't it? It could be a sculpture. I mean, it's got the amount of work that you could see in sculptures and pieces of art. I mean, look at the level of work, the carvings and just the ornateness of it all. It's pretty incredible.
The bed is one of more than 300 separate pieces, custom-made by Thomas Chippendale. And according to family legend, it is used just the once. Nothing is too lavish for the client, Edwin Lascelles, the first Baron of Harewood.
He was probably one of the kind of wealthiest men in the country. He actually inherited quite a lot of his money from his father, Henry Lascelles, who made most of his money in the sugar trade, which of course relied heavily on the labour of a huge amount of enslaved individuals. He was also a banker to various plantation owners, and of course, when they defaulted on their loan, he then acquired their property. He also owned sugar distribution warehouses, as well as slave ships.
It's an interesting filter, particularly for me, to look through, to see this beauty, but I think, tinged with something else.
Imagine if money were no object. What is it that you could achieve? Something which is utter architectural perfection. Fill it with the most glorious things. Reynolds, Chippendale. Decorate it with the most innovative interior design that could be shown to other people of a similar and higher station, to demonstrate wealth, to be places where one might go for weekends of deal-making, surrounded by luxury.
Much of the interior splendour of Harewood is designed by Robert Adam, channeling the spirit of the Scottish Enlightenment.
The Adam family were the most influential architects, not simply in 18th century Scotland, but in Britain and Europe.
Adam and his brothers were all very much part of the Enlightenment conversations.
It conveys order and restraint.
The symmetry, the balance, the emphasis on reason of the Scottish Enlightenment.
And in that sense, Adam is the greatest of classical architect of the era.
Beneath Adam's ceilings, a new breed of English artists emerges. When Joshua Reynolds starts his career, great English painting is in its infancy. By the end of it, his portraits are hanging in Britain's grandest houses.
Reynolds is an insider. He produces aspirant images, images that revive classical postures. So when you see people represented in a Reynolds portrait, they are represented in their best light. So people want to be seen in a Reynolds light.
In Pride of Place, a portrait of Edwin Lascelles, 1st Baron of Harewood, by who else? Joshua Reynolds.
I mean, it's really interesting looking at this portrait of Edwin, who built this place. Next to him, you've got Edward. It's his uncle, I believe, with what is a trade ship behind him. He's got the British ensign, I guess going off to the Caribbean. So all the imagery is there, all the signifiers, all the kind of the nods to the industry which brought them this power and money is there in these portraits. As I look at it, I have really mixed feelings because obviously it is beautiful to look at, but I'm half Jamaican. I think even if you're not, it's, in the contemporary context, thinking about the history, it kind of weighs heavy. My work kind of critiques portraiture. It's definitely not portraiture itself. I mean, it's often mistaken for the thing it's critiquing. It tries to take this notion of what a monument is and what power is constantly presented as, and use a certain element of nonchalance to reject those physical and visual tropes. So to reject this idea of standing proud and shoulders back, because, particularly for black people, it's been, you have to present yourself in a particular way in order to kind of neutralize a perceived threat. Here, there is just that casualness and this absolute privilege, really. The word is used a lot, and I think some people have switched off to it, but it's present here.
But Georgian privilege does have its critics. Among them, British artists exposing the realities of British life, like William Hogarth.
The key images that come to mind immediately for me when I think of the 18th century are the paintings and engravings of Hogarth. Sort of ruddy faces, thick woolen jackets, yellow waistcoats, shiny boots, green trees, these very English colourings. So he's telling a story about Britishness through his paintings, and he's exposing the difference between that neoclassical facade of the 18th century and the cruelty, the hypocrisy that exists alongside it.
When it comes to fine art, before Hogarth, the British import it. But Hogarth is the first guy who sets out to create, a native British art. What is it that he thinks is peculiarly British? Honesty, reality, raw, visceral realism.
Marriage à la mode is a series of paintings, and it is basically the marriage of the son of a man called the Earl of Squanderfield, and of course his name is indicative of what he might have done with his old money, and he is trying to marry his son off to the daughter of a merchant who is new money. It doesn't end very well for anybody. Sorry to be the, bearer of bad news.
In 6 separate paintings, Hogarth charts the loveless marriage from infidelity to murder and suicide.
She's dying, and her father is removing her ring from her finger because he's not going to let her be buried with a gold ring. I mean, that's money.
And outside, London goes on. This is just another story in the rich pageant of London life.
I think he thought his job was to observe what was going on and to show every nasty layer of it.
Turner Prize winner Lubaina Himid is part of a tradition laid down by Hogarth. And her installation from 1986, A Fashionable Marriage, was directly inspired by Marriage à la mode.
It is extraordinary. I mean, when I think about how long ago Hogarth was painting, I'm still kind of astonished. Surely this can't be, But then it's not extraordinary because they're so totally about human behaviour. And why in 250 years would human behaviour have changed?
Hogarth is the son of a bankrupted schoolteacher with a chip on his shoulder as huge as his talent. Wildly successful, he never loses the common touch and a deep distaste for the elite.
Hogarth, I adore. He was a moralizer, and his achievements are breathtaking. But he was a thug, and his English art is always about lived reality on the streets of London. And he's concerned to convey the vitality of his own world and to tell what he thinks of as the truth about corruption, the truth about affectation. the truth about London. An English art that is independent of the classical fantasies of Sir Joshua Reynolds.
New printing technology makes his work more accessible to the masses. But Hogarth's blunt honesty doesn't win him many rich patrons. That's for painters who sucked up to their sitters, painters like his arch-rival, Joshua Reynolds.
They can't stand each other. Hogarth in particular can't stand Reynolds. In the 1760s, they're both living on opposite sides of Leicester Square, but they don't talk to each other. Hogarth cannot stand his affectations. He can't bear the fact that Reynolds' first act is to get the London sheriff's second-hand coach and have his own coat of arms painted on, and have his wife sit in it and go round to the shops. He can't stand that kind of bullshit.
He's a modern artist.
He's a rough diamond.
He's a modern artist who defines himself as British, proudly British. Hogarthian is Dickensian, but with more gin, gambling, prostitutes as well, and also jokes. Let's not forget the jokes. How British is that? We're so proud of our sense of humour. We see that as quintessentially British. Hogarth invents the graphic novel. I mean, how 21st century is that? You can't get more, more today than a graphic novel.
I mean, I tried to be as vulgar as him. I tried to be as rude and nasty, but you have to have real balls to be Hogarth.
This is the fourth picture in the series, The Toilette, and it was reinterpreted by Lubaina Himid, swapping Hogarth's disdain for high society with her own for the art world establishment. And on the edge of it all, in her work and in Hogarth's, two displaced people of colour. In Hogarth's work, they are servants. In Himid's, aspiring black artists and thinkers. On the outside, looking in.
The point about having black servants in your household, dressed in silly clothes, is to signify how wealthy you were. I mean, if you can employ people to just decorate your room, then sure, you are really, really rich. So I needed to kind of turn that on its head and bring a kind of a sense that there are two people in the room that are not center stage. They're not what the story's about, but they are absolutely present.
And Hamid's black characters play a similar role to those in Hogarth's original. A subtle but important one.
Of course, you have the presence of two servants who are of color. One is African and one may be Indian. And they too are there to sort of turn up the heat on this critique of pretenses and people who are going about things in what Hogarth considers to be the wrong way.
They're meant to speak about inequality, and they are meant to be mechanisms for bursting bubbles, and that they very often they stand like figures in Greek theatre that look out at the audience and say, you can't escape this. You are culpable. You are part of this.
The 18th century is the age in which the values and the beliefs which we think of as modern were mostly forged, because it was a century of kind of great intellectual, literary, creative freedom. England becomes really the first modern country in which you can print and publish whatever you feel like. I mean, you can be much nastier and ruder about public figures in the early 18th century than you can be now. And that produces an outpouring of controversy, pamphlets, political argument, but also satire, mockery.
If you think about the character of literary culture in the early 18th century, it was dominated by satirists, by wonderful writers like Jonathan Swift. Swift makes you laugh uneasily, and I think an awful lot of the best contemporary political satire does that too. Jonathan Swift was Anglo-Irish. He didn't like to think of himself as Irish. He says that his mother happened to drop him in Ireland, like a cow.
He is part of a long line of writers who characterize the Catholic Irish as wild or savage or somehow subhuman. And these are caricatures that have real impacts.
It is a melancholy object to those who walk through this great town or travel in the country to see the streets, the roads, the cabin doors crowded with beggars of the female sex, followed by 3, 4, or 6 children, all in rags, and importuning every passenger for an alms.
We have absentee landowners. Money and goods are being taken out of Ireland. Food is being exported in massive quantities to feed England, to feed the Royal Navy. In 1740, at least 400,000 people die of starvation.
This is what Swift wants to spotlight: British callousness towards what is effectively a colony.
He is a clarion voice against the mismanagement that he sees in Ireland, against the ravages of the landlord class.
A Modest Proposal is based on the kind of pamphlet culture that was really very widespread in coffee houses. People would publish a pamphlet saying, I've got this brilliant idea. This is what we should do in order to make more money here, or this would improve people's lives. And he says that this is just a modest proposal.
It begins as if it is about concern, when actually what it wants to do is advance to a position 4,000 words later where it has, it's about economics. He spends a really long time establishing the premise of how much meat costs and how much it costs to raise a child. Then suddenly, I shall now therefore humbly propose my own thoughts,
which I hope will not be liable to the least objection.
Thinking, what's that going to be then? You've certainly done your research, and it's bang.
I've been assured by a very knowing American of my acquaintance in London that a young, healthy child, well-nursed, is at 8 years old a most delicious, nourishing and wholesome food, whether stewed, roasted, baked or boiled. And I make no doubt would serve equally in a fricassee or a ragout.
You know, that's a sharp intake of breath moment if that were a live performance.
He has wonderful ideas like, you can skin a baby and make literal kid gloves. And he says it in this tone of complete reasonableness. It's just, here's a good way of cooking a child.
Butchers, we are assured, will not be wanting, although I recommend buying the children alive and dressing them hot from the knife, as we do roasting pigs.
All of these heinous proposals are couched in the sensible mathematical language of the political proposals of his day.
It's like sort of locks on a canal. You sort of get to this one level and think, that's it, and then there's another one, and then there's another one, and by the end you can't really believe the position he's at. I mean, there seem to be things in it there seems to be a paragraph where he seems to be suggesting that boys should be hunted like deer.
That way of not really being able to say what you mean directly, always having a bit of a reserve, almost a sort of self-protection. No, I didn't really say that. Maybe that's what you heard, but that's not actually what I said, a kind of aloofness. The clever people, the people I care about, will understand what I'm saying.
I think we're still talking about A Modest Proposal now because it's something of a gold standard, I think, in terms of how to go about this kind of comedy. I think Swift is a disappointed idealist. You see the same thing in a lot of stand-ups that are accused of being cynics. You see this really explicitly in Swift.
And hidden amongst the sarcasm, signs of an emerging national conscience. As the Industrial Revolution gets underway, a new non-conformist middle class starts to grow. Pioneering capitalists who create and service an emerging consumer culture, but also bring morality to the table. Tea and empathy. Emma Bridgewater has built a successful company out of ceramics, just like her hero, Josiah Wedgwood.
Am I right in thinking that it's a mid-late 18th century thing that tea becomes fashionable?
Bang on.
Dr. Vicky Avery is Keeper of Applied Arts at the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge.
Basically, at the beginning of the century, tea is really only available to absolutely the wealthiest. But really, because of greater production, more types of tea coming in, more people lower down the social spectrum are able to buy it. And there's a boom in tea ware.
The use of Cornish clay and limitless local coal put Stoke-on-Trent on the map, where Emma started her own business using many of the same principles of mass production that Wedgwood pioneers. Wedgwood's constant experimentation with new glazes brings science and creativity together in the pursuit of a roaring trade.
I mean, he really was a sort of Henry Ford of his day. He looked at the process of making and broke it down into its component steps. He defined taste and aspiration, you know, as the middle classes suddenly exploded into the world. I love the fact that he described himself as vase maker general to the world. He seemed to know that there was a need for the kit that people would use to define themselves. I think Wedgwood's great achievement was his understanding, his intuition of how we were developing as a society. I think he was a genius, and I don't use the word lightly.
I think of him as a larger-than-life creative force, but I don't admire him. I do see him as an exploiter of his workforce. He, at one point, said, I need to turn my men into machines, and pretty well turned them into machines. He divided labour precisely so that a man making cup handles would never make anything other than cup handles. He brings in women, but underpays them. In the 18th century, the great and the good are totally indifferent to the exploitation of the English wage force. So it's a dilemma, isn't it? It's the cruelty of progress.
But Wedgwood's vision does make him wildly rich and able to pursue the progressive cause he really does believe in, the abolition of the slave trade by any means necessary.
Depending where you're sitting on the tea table.
I'm pouring. This is what I can see.
And then you see that, and that's actually very interesting. In the corner, and you can see a black African servant slave.
You think he's probably there for a reason?
I think so. I think he would use the pottery for political ends, and I think as a pioneer and a philanthropist, he's going to use any mechanism he's got to get discussions going over a nice cup of tea. Come over to Mass, have a cup of tea.
To sort of stir the conversation.
As you're stirring your sugar, you stir the conversation, I think so.
Yes. If you were very virtuous, you gave up sugar.
That's right.
But Wedgwood is not content with dropping polite hints. He also produces thousands of campaigning medals given away for free, more than 200 years before Black Lives Matter.
Do you know, I've never held one of the real medallions.
Wedgwood got this particular logo, if you like, designed by his chief designer. And this became really the motto, if you like, of the abolitionist movement. And you can see just
yes,
in
you can do, I think you have to know, you almost have to know, this is so small, but I think it says, am I not a man and a brother?
And a brother, question mark. Because they're slightly smaller, then you can
the size
actually
of a coin, yes,
put them in your hair or a necklace or a bracelet, and you wear them. You don't have to say anything. It's a statement of intent. It's showing your solidarity. It says, I am a supporter of, you know, the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade. And women who had no voice would wear this, and it was a way of spreading the message.
Absolutely.
In a really effective way.
The kneeling, it's difficult because it does fix forever a particular kind of subjugation as being the representation of a race. But he recognized a kind of aesthetic compromise that was necessary to carry his message, and he recognized how to make that difference.
But popular cynicism challenges public sympathy. While some put down their sugar spoons in support of abolition, one man sharpens his knife. James Gillray, creator of a tradition to which Martin Rowson is an heir, the British political cartoon.
The 18th century is seen as the age of reason, but in fact, what it is the Enlightenment with an open sewer of satire running through it, from Swift via Hogarth up to Gillray.
So they're not soft, they're not sentimental. There's not a touch of sentimentality in Gillray. He's a Tory, but there's a kind of even-handed hatred that goes on.
People were reading these cartoons in exquisite clothing as they were walking down streets through which were flowing rivers of shit and squashed cats, and you'd walk round a corner and you'd see a child being publicly executed for stealing a bum. So there is a stench of shit surrounding the whole of the 18th century, which people of a nervous disposition choose to ignore. Gillray was a cartoonist. He wasn't a radical or a reactionary. He was a hack like the rest of us. He was producing stuff to be bought and sold. He was fulfilling an absolutely essential political function, which is the right to laugh at those people who think that they are wiser and better than we are and want us to treat them like gods.
He was a good hater. And in a caricaturist and cartoonist, you need a good hater.
So here's this one.
You need someone who hates humanity enough to put the knife in at every turn.
In his print on the royal family as anti-Saccharites, he puts them around the tea table and they're there grimacing because they have to swallow this really bitter tea because they can't sweeten it with Caribbean sugar. It's very, very visceral because the wider anti-Saccharite campaign was telling people, look, if you consume slave-produced sugar, you're literally consuming like a pound of enslaved flesh.
The Queen is having tea with the King and with the princesses.
Queen Charlotte is basically saying, you know, it's a very refreshing drink the way it is, and you will find that in doing this, you'll also be helped to save the poor blackie Moors, you know. So she's the one advocating.
There's a gesture of that kind of virtue signalling that is fashionable, but not intrinsically serious. That's what he's saying.
One of the great things about Gillray was he could capture everything he needs to say about the state of mind in the face of this lady here. A kind of mortified, on the edge of tears, oh, the world is such a terrible place, the pity of it all, which is also immeasurably self-serving. Clearly, these people are on the right side, but it doesn't stop them being utterly awful. Of course, it's a marriage of text and imagery, so there's a part of every cartoonist, which is also an impressionist. You'll try and catch the modulations of the voice of your victims, and George III was famous for repeating things. So he's saying, yes, very good, delicious. Well, he's quintessentially British because of what he did and the way he did it, and that was because he was born into an environment which made that possible. Britain of the 18th century, where there was no press censorship to all intents and purposes.
This is topical satire in a time before tabloids.
Well, it's the tradition of dealing with serious issues by mocking them, which is actually part of what the British like to think sort of defines their notion of liberty. You know, one of the great complaints about the British is they sneer at success. And I think that's a rather good thing. I rather like the fact that we're moaning all the time about things, which is actually more British than any idea of a kind of satirical tradition. But the satirical tradition is part of the moaning, in fact. It's part of that cement which keeps society together, just ceaseless whining about everything.
By the end of the 18th century, new voices are changing the tone of the national conversation. Some of the farthest reaching, unusually, are female. Mary Wollstonecraft writes a book that changes the world.
It is time to effect a revolution in female manners. Time to restore to them their lost dignity and make them as part of the human species. Labour by reforming themselves to reform the world.
Wollstonecraft lives at Newington Green in North London, where she founds a school for girls. Near to the site is a controversial sculpture by Maggie Hambling, commissioned in her memory.
She was a rebel. She challenged everything around her. I mean, it's that spirit that I hope my sculpture is about. You know, when I make a portrait of anyone, the spirit of the person is what is important.
She's quite critical of women, and I think a lot of readers now find this really uncomfortable. She's critical of women for failing to do better, for falling into the trap of subjugation, for, in effect, enslaving themselves to this ideology of femininity, sensibility, weakness, an obsession with beauty and mere surface.
She was fighting and challenging everything around her. The sculpture refers to the sort of the history and the struggle of women throughout time, and it's also rather sexy, I think. A strong, challenging woman.
Why is she naked?
Well, she may very well have spent a good deal of her time naked by the accounts of her love life. Quite a goer, as my mother would have said. A child out of wedlock, affairs with women as well as men. I mean, she died at 38. I mean, I think she'd probably worn herself out. I hope it is a metaphor for the spirit of Mary Wollstonecraft and the way she challenged everything around her and the way we all have to keep confronting, challenging, being ready to act.
The Enlightenment values questions as much as answers, new ideas as much as received certainties, and it sets the scene for radical political thinking.
Is there for honest poverty that hangs his head and all that?
A pearl is an irritation inside of an oyster. So to be an irritant is not always bad. And that's Robert Burns. And the irritation is what makes a pearl.
In 2017, Turner Prize winner Douglas Gordon was commissioned by the National Portrait Gallery of Scotland to make a new work in honour of his lifelong hero. Robert Burns, the writer of A Man's a Man for All That. Written in 1795, the poem was turned into a song so powerfully resonant that it was sung at the inauguration of the Scottish Parliament in 1999.
Burns's poetry makes audible almost the robust scepticism amongst ordinary people about almost everything that their rulers and betters told them. It's a poetry where you can hear what people talked about in alehouses or on farms, the native truculence of ordinary people.
Burns was just being Burns. Burns was being who he was. And that's why people took to him so much. That's why they took to his poems, because he was honest in how he presented himself.
He's in touch with the people in a way that other writers are not.
It's actually a way of inventing a new Scottishness.
In the mythology of Scotland, there are two men that you want to look like. Sean Connery is dead and gone, but Robert Burns is still alive.
The poem is disdainful and celebratory. It's disdainful of people who think they're great because of what they've got. It's the sort of egalitarianism of that Enlightenment view of the world.
You see yon Birkie called a lord, with struts and stairs and all that. Though hundreds worship at his word, he's but a coof for all that.
See yon Birkie called a lord, who struts and stares and all that. Birkie is Scots for fellow.
And he sees the aristocrat and he says a word which I'm not quite sure exactly what it means.
Though hundreds worship at his words, he's but a coof and all that.
A coof, C-O-O-F. What's a coof?
A coof is idiot, stupid person.
It's a wonderful word.
Burns has a degree of contempt for the governing classes of his native Scotland in that period.
It's a kind of little fragment of barroom philosophy almost. A man's a man for all that is used to say in ordinary language something quite fundamental, something humanistic, something which is actually very much, I think, part of the sort of Scottish Enlightenment way of thinking.
But this didn't stop Burns, like so many other impoverished Scots, from booking a passage to the colonies for a job on a Jamaican plantation, even if he never actually went to the West Indies in the end.
While he was particularly strong-minded in his understanding of the rights of man, where that actually sits in terms of how he viewed the atrocities of the transatlantic slave trade are very much up for discussion.
If we try and kind of discover in our writers of the past the things we want them to have thought, we're going to be in big trouble. But the contradictions of his life should be, highlighted, because it's a real lesson to stop us simplifying the past and projecting our virtuous selves onto the past.
These contradictions, in Burns and in the Age of Enlightenment itself, are set in stone in two very different statues. The first sits in the Scottish National Portrait Gallery in Edinburgh. The second is by Douglas Gordon. And he hasn't waited for it to be knocked from its pedestal. He's done it himself.
There's a beautiful Flaxman sculpture in Edinburgh. He's white. I just wanted to have him black so that nobody feels left out. He represents a rogue, a rascal, a romantic rebel, and there are bits of him here and there, British and Scottish, and by breaking him up, let's see if we can put him back together. That's why he's in pieces. Yeah?
Late Georgian Britain is a place of tensions and contradictions, of national heroes with feet of clay, and virtue as well as vice, or the appearance of it at any rate, preserved at all costs.
The upwardly mobile and the prospering middle classes and the gentry are a bubble wanting recognition, status, standing in relation to the vulgar mob, through manners, through respectability and gentility.
So the tone of culture changes quite a lot, and women are taken more seriously than they were as thinkers, writers, readers. But they're also expected to be much more modest and well-behaved.
My wife can't understand my attitude to Jane Austen. It's funny, it's mildly amusing, but I do feel she's a bit precious, that she is, of course, remarkable as one of the female renaissance of the late 18th century.
She's one of the most unexpected geniuses in all English literature, or any literature, actually. Before Jane Austen came along, as a novelist, you sort of had a choice. Do I write in the first person? Takes you right into the character, but they only know some things, they don't know others. Or do I narrate in the third person, in which case the novel, you're standing godlike and moving the people around like chess pieces, but you're not inside them. And Jane Austen sort of solved it. Incredible, miracle. At the heart of all her novels was this technique called free and direct style, where you narrate in the third person, but you let the narration be coloured by the assumptions, the prejudices, the limited knowledge of the character.
Jane Austen's third published novel is perhaps the least known book by one of our most famous writers. With a reputation for earnestness, it is in fact a study of subtle subversion and a coded cry for emancipation.
Mansfield Park was the last Jane Austen novel I read. I only read it 2 years ago because I've been putting it off because it seemed like sort of the least appealing. It's certainly one of the less popular of her novels. But actually, I really liked it.
And then you kissed her and she stayed over and now you're going to get married and you'll be off my hands.
Nope.
Actor Rachel Parris and friends perform the comedy improv show, Ostentatious.
We know the culture so well, even if we don't know we do. So we found that our audiences have often responded to it in a really big way, even when they didn't even realise how much Jane Austen they knew. And this is the table where she wrote her novels, including Mansfield Park. Amazing to see it.
Mansfield Park concerns the life of Fanny Price, who is the child of a woman who married badly, and she is allowed to live with her wealthy family as a sort of charitable act.
Fanny Price has been plucked out of poverty and given at the age of 10 to a family who don't treat her very nicely, really.
She's a quietly strong-willed character, but still as powerless as almost all women in that era, including Austen herself.
I think that Jane Austen is partly basing her novels on life and experience, but she's working very precisely in a particular period of a young woman's life, 2 or 3 years, where she has a little bit of freedom of movement between her father owning her and her husband owning her, and what kind of give? What kind of leeway and elbow room can a woman make for herself in her life?
In other words, just like the heroine in Mansfield Park, the quiet, subversive Fanny Price.
Against every reason, apart from her own conviction, she refuses marriage to a really, really wealthy man, repeatedly. Even when everyone in her life is going, marry him, marry him, marry him, she still says no. And that action alone is enough to make me like her, because if she was weak, if she was insipid, she would have just gone, oh, all right then, yeah. But she didn't.
To read Austen's works as just a series of people visiting each other's houses and saying catty things, I think is to miss the extent of her engagement with the forces of class and gender that shape her own life, and those are the people she's writing about.
I can't see the difference between one plot and another, and it's all to do with the hunting of a polite and well-heeled husband. Yes, it's funny, it's mildly amusing, but it's so remote from the kinds of violent realities of the Regency years. It's quintessentially artificial.
It's not just about weddings. It drives me mad when people say that. What you're looking at is a woman making an economic decision for the benefit of herself and her family. It's not just about weddings, it's about complex negotiations of power.
And in the background of the novel are a handful of clues as to where that power might actually come from.
She's the poor relation who's gone to live with a rich family, and it becomes clear a little way through the novel that most of their fortune comes from Antigua. And readers at the time would have known Antigua, means sugar, means probably slaves.
Austen is almost certainly opposed to slavery, and after the British trade is outlawed in 1807, her own brother chases renegade slavers around the Caribbean as an officer in the Royal Navy.
So her life is involved with slavery, but it's interesting also that it's off stage, it's off camera. And that, I think, is probably true of the experience of slavery for many English people.
But by the end of the century, it has become harder and harder to ignore, thanks in part to a searing autobiography that finally gives an authentic voice to the voiceless.
Olaudah Equiano was an African man who was captured into slavery and then was sold within the transatlantic slave trade, became a servant, and then worked his way through different situations to eventually buy his own freedom. And then he eventually published a book about his life, which became a sort of bestseller. You have to remember, all the stories that are being told, mostly by British writers, about slavery that include African characters are ventriloquized. So they are always speaking on behalf of. And it's really only Equiano and all those who put pen to paper that get to speak on their own behalf. He's really quite amazing, yeah.
At the West India Docks in East London, the statue of a famous slave owner is removed. And as Britain confronts its past, Equiano's book helped start that process.
By the time he publishes, it's also a political document. He is part of the campaign for the abolition of the slave trade.
Surely this traffic cannot be good, which spreads like a pestilence and taints what it touches, which violates the first natural right of mankind, equality and independency, and gives one man a dominion over his fellows, which God could never intend.
We are here to remember Olaudah Equiano. He was an important abolitionist, and he wrote his memoirs about his life and times at this address.
He has a voice, and he shapes through his narrative a response to that moment, which is transformative not just for him, but for everyone it touches in that period.
The closeness of the place and the heat of the climate added to the number in the ship, which was so crowded that each had scarcely room to turn himself and almost suffocated us. This wretched situation was again aggravated by the galling of the chains and the filth of the necessary tubs into which the children often fell and almost suffocated. Shrieks of the women and the groans of the dying rendered the whole a scene of horror, almost inconceivable.
We think about Olaudah Equiano daring to write down a kind of autoethnography, a biography, not just of his own life, but by implication, the lives of all those other invisibilized subjects who didn't have the opportunities he did to be seen. He writes on their behalf. And every word that he writes in that autobiography is an assertion of our lives matter, my life matters, because it's demonstrative of the magic that can take place against all odds. All of that is still in the atmosphere, is still part of the discussion.
When I saw the Colson statue being taken down from its plinth, I thought, bliss was it in that dawn to be alive.
And I was amazed that he was still there to be thrown into the dock. I don't find crowds ripping things up or down exciting or pleasing, actually, because I don't think that's how it should happen.
That moment is iconic. What we do with that moment, I think, is another matter. I think the conversation needs to go on some more.
There are certain things that need to be undone. This is why we are not finished.
If I think about the 18th century, I think it's a time of opportunity, of people making huge amounts of money, of incredible inequalities developing because of that. And alongside that, there is that thing that I think we should feel most proud of, the quiet, marginal voice of people who say, wait a minute, all of this progress cannot be at the cost of those who are most marginalized. Those are the people that define our nation's history, that define it through our best art.
Next time, industry unleashes British creativity in the workshop of the world, but splits Britain between town and country as the promise of the future fights nostalgia for the past. When did you last subvert the status quo? Be inspired by some of the incredible but overlooked individuals who disrupted history with their creativity. Go to bbc.co.uk/art that made us and follow the links to the Open University.